Well, good evening all. Good evening and welcome to tonight's information session regarding the draft scoping requirements in the EES process for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project. It's great to have so many of you here tonight. My name is Chris Robinson. I will be your moderator tonight. I'm independent of the project and I've been invited by the Department of Environment, Water, well, I'm not going to get this right, Jack, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, DELWP, many people refer it to assist in tonight's conversation, to get through as many questions as we can and to provide you as much information as you can to make sure your contributions to the draft process, the draft scoping requirements for the ES are as impactful as possible. So firstly, I'd like to thank you. In a moment, I'll be introducing Jack Crone, who's a Senior Impact Assessor in the Impact Assessment Unit of the department. But before I do, I'd like to just perhaps run through some housekeeping other matters before we do. So in terms of tonight, it's important we also acknowledge that tonight we're meeting all over the place. Well, I'm meeting here today in Wurundjeri land, so I like to pay the respects of the traditional owners where I meet today, and we're meeting all over the place. Some of you would be out west and south and north of the project site. So I'd like to extend my welcome to you if you're from other communities, and elders past, present and future, and for those who may be with us here tonight. In terms of housekeeping, I think there's a couple of things I think it's important for us to go through, so I'll make a few comments on that. We're going to have the discussion tonight's really in two main parts. We'll be hearing from Jack for about 15 or 20 minutes about the process, the outline of what is an environmental effects statement, what is the process, and what stage are we now at. And Jack will talk us through the draft scoping requirements for the EES for this important project. Then we're going to spend the most of tonight responding to questions that you may have about that. Now, I might just make a comment that in terms of the ability for Jack to respond to the project decisions, he won't be able to do that. We'll be talking tonight as much as we can about the process of the EES, and Jack is here, he'll be able to do that. In terms of questions that come through, I'll be encouraging you to focus, if best you can, about the environmental effects statement process and the systems and tools you have available to contribute to that. If questions do come through and they're about the project or they're about the specific nature of the decisions that might be made, we'll ensure that those questions are recorded. We'll also make sure that those questions are managed so we can send the question to the right person. I'll talk about that in a few moments. Jack Crone will be our speaker tonight, so I might just welcome Jack to our group. So welcome, Jack. I'll introduce you in a session. But firstly, in terms of tonight, in terms of our housekeeping, the sessions tonight will be recorded. I might just flick the slides on to make sure we're following the bouncing ball here. The sessions tonight will be recorded, and we'll be consolidating those and posting them on the project website after tonight's session. So in terms of questions you might have about the process, I'm going to invite you to put them through the Q&A function, which is in the bottom of your screen. And they'll be collected throughout the night by our team, which are working behind the scenes. I'll be making sure that we get through as many as we possibly can. I would invite you to ask your question as succinctly as possible. And if you wish your name to be read, please do so. Or perhaps at the location where you're watching or tuning in for us tonight, that will help us as well. Now, as I said, the questions we don't get through, we'll be following up as best we can via email. The ones that relate to the specific process that DELWP is managing, Jack and his team will be looking after those responses. With regard to a specific project question, those questions will be forwarded onto the project team to follow up as they normally have been doing so. And just a reminder that if there's any offensive language or other inappropriate comments coming through, of course, we won't be able to make those questions known. So just a reminder of the project time before I welcome Jack to the panel. The project timing looks a little bit like this. Next slide, thanks. The project has started. There's consultation going on. Many of you have been involved in consultation activities, either online or through other communication methods. There will be certainly a long stage of the planning and approvals, and Jack will talk through the EES phasing and timing shortly, but that'll be ending effectively around mid-2022. So it's a good period of time left for the approvals and the conditions or otherwise or consideration of the project. Should a permit be issued and the EES be approved, construction is expected to occur for another couple of years after that. So we've got a long way ahead of us in some ways, but as many of you would know, each of these small steps are very, very important for us. So here we are. We've got till 8 o'clock tonight. I'd like to welcome Jack to the panel. Firstly, say hello, Jack, and if you could briefly introduce yourself and say hello, and maybe we could talk us through what is the environmental effects statement, where are we at in the process, and we can take it from there. Over to you, Jack.
Thanks very much, Chris, and yeah, pleasure to be here. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands across which we're all meeting tonight. I'm also on the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of those peoples and elders of all traditional owner communities who may be participating tonight. Yeah, I work in the Impact Assessment Unit in DELWP. I've been there for a while now, and I deal with the EES process for projects that are subject to that process, and also projects that may be subject to assessment processes under other systems, such as the Commonwealth EPBC system, when that's been accredited for us. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak tonight, and I hope that I can help to clarify for people what the advertisement of the draft scoping requirements for the project means, and how stakeholders and community members can make the most of this opportunity to participate in the process. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. And just very quickly, and some people may have listened to me a month or two ago, so I'll go through this quite quickly. But by way of context, the Environment Effects Act is Victoria's expression of environmental impact assessment practice. It's a very brief act. You can read it very quickly. It doesn't contain a lot of procedural prescription. We have ministerial guidelines, which you can see on our website, and they set out most of the detail about how the process is implemented and administered. We also operate in this case, and for many EESs, under the bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth, under the cumbersomely named Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act. So the Commonwealth Minister will consider the assessment of the Victorian Minister for Planning before making decisions under the EPBC Act. So if we could go on to the next, please. And this just sort of sets out very, very quickly the sequence. And the orange scoping phase is the point that we're up to. So this is a standard series or sequence of steps that applies to impact assessment. And it's embraced in Victorian process. While it's presented like a nice, neat sequence, the reality is that there's often overlap from step to step. And this is a good example where we are at the moment. A proponent can and almost always does progress EES studies on the basis of its own expectations about what the likely scope is going to be. And if the final scope differs in some respect from that anticipated coverage, then that just means the proponent may have to revisit some of that work and bring it into line with the designated scope. If we go to the next one, which is also really the same sequence, but it just highlights the points where DELWP is responsible for managing a public comment phase. So we're at the first of those stages now. There will be another opportunity for public submissions when the EES is exhibited, which we expect to be somewhere in 2022. And those who make written submissions at that time will also have the opportunity to address the inquiry during its hearings. In between now and then, there will still be engagement opportunities. They will be conducted by the proponent under its EES consultation plan, which we expect to be published very soon. If we could move on. So these are the things that are involved in providing guidance to a proponent about what they need to do when they're required to prepare an EES. the Act, which is, as I said, very simple and talks about the potential for significant effects on the environment. Ministerial guidelines that set out how the process works to achieve those purposes of the Act. The Minister issues what are called procedures and requirements under the Act, and they're reproduced in full in Appendix A of the draft scoping requirements. It's only a page or so. And then the scoping requirements themselves, which is where you will find the detail of the required coverage. So if we could move on again, scoping requirements come from the Minister. This is the first public opportunity. It's important to understand that the scoping requirements are not generally going to be prescriptive about how issues should be investigated, and they won't preempt what the findings of studies might be. Ultimately, the onus remains on the proponent to prepare an adequate EES and to take responsibility for the quality of that EES. But the scoping requirements will be really important in providing a benchmark when the proponent believes they have completed the EES and it's ready for exhibition. There is a process that we refer to as authorisation, where we review what the proponent has done, and the scoping requirements essentially provide the list that we need to make sure everything that should have been there is actually in the document and to an adequate standard. So the stage we're at the moment is the 15 business days for public comment on those draft scoping requirements. I'll just go on to the next one. And
before we do, Jack, I might just invite everyone to watch their chat box, because we might just pop up the address of the scoping requirements where those documents are currently online. So for those who have had a chance to download them or look at them online, that's great. For those who don't know where they are, we'll just pop them up in the chat box, and you'll be able to click through either tonight or, in fact, of course, later on. So sorry, Jack, I just want to make sure that everyone knew what we were talking about.
That's fine. So as I said, this is a standard part of the EES process, and you can see not only the draft scoping requirements for Western Victoria Transmission Network project, but if you look at the browse projects on our webpage, you can see scoping requirements for the other EESs that are in progress as well. So we do follow a standard structure. There is a sort of evolutionary process in the context of continuous improvement, because we're always learning lessons from the experience that we have with each project. So the introduction just sets the scene very briefly. It quotes some key points from the procedures and requirements. The second section talks about the process. It identifies the key statutory approvals requirements that we understand at the time the scoping requirements are set. The onus will still remain with the proponent to identify all the statutory approvals that the project may be subject to. If there are statutory approvals that have a role for third parties, so things like planning permits, for example, where people have the opportunity to make submissions, then part of our role is to coordinate the procedures so that when the EES is exhibited, that also constitutes the opportunity to make comment for the purposes of those statutory approvals. And as I've said, this is a controlled action under the EPBC Act, so the EES is serving as the accredited process, and that's explained in the document. Then if we go on to section 3 on the next slide, again, this is relatively standard structure. In the general approach, it talks about a systems-based approach and a risk-based approach. A systems-based approach means that we are looking for an integrated approach to the EES. So there will undoubtedly be technical specialists who will carry out technical studies investigating particular issues, but the onus is on the proponent to draw all that material together so that we don't just finish up with a series of siloed studies on noise or vibration or biodiversity or whatever without those things being brought together. The risk is talking about proportionality, essentially. What are the issues that are the most important for this particular EES? So that will vary from one EES to another.
And Jack, is that something that the community you're looking for some feedback on during this scoping study in terms of the most important things that need to be covered? Is that what you're looking for?
That could certainly be a really useful thing for people to provide us with some comment on.
Okay, thank you.
Then there's a project description, and the scoping requirements set out the sorts of elements of the project that need to be included in that description. Project alternatives, it comes down to feasibility and the potential for avoiding or reducing impacts. So you'll see in the draft scoping requirements a couple of little sort of lists of dot points, the first of which is about the project elements that we think may be potentially amenable to consideration of alternatives, and the second set of dot points is about how consideration of those possible alternatives should be carried out.
Now, Jack, we may come back to the alternatives question before we go tonight, because I know there's a lot of questions about why couldn't we consider route X, or why can't we consider route Y, or why can't we go a different design? Now, that's not something that you can stipulate in the scoping requirements for the EES, is that correct?
It's not something that we will stipulate, no. And the scoping requirements start essentially from the point where the Minister has said do an EES, and the referral for the EES identified an area of interest. Now, I said that we expect that proponents will be continuing to work while we're going through this process, and they may be progressing towards refining that area of interest. But the EES will have to describe that process all the way through, from the point where the area of interest was designated down to, by the time the EES is ready for exhibition, it may well be, in fact, it's probably likely that the proponent will have identified a preferred alignment, a preferred design, a preferred form of the project. The EES will need to explain how it has progressed to that point.
Okay, thank you.
And how those potential options have been evaluated, compared, discarded or progressed, as the case may be. Then there's an expectation about applicable legislation being identified. Again, this places the onus on the proponent to identify all the relevant legislation. The draft evaluation objectives are mentioned at this point, but the actual objectives head up each of the subsections in section 4. And the environmental management framework is where we look for the proponent to explain its intended approach to dealing with residual impacts and things that may need to be managed. And if we go on to the next one, and this is where I guess the bulk of the project-specific content in the document will be found. Each of the specific environmental effects that sort of has a subsection to itself, and they are brackets of effects. They're not very widely separated, but we use this standard structural approach of key issues. So what could be affected? What's there now? What are the possible nature of the effects? How will they be managed or reduced? What effects might be left after that management is done, and how is that going to be monitored, managed, so that the impacts are kept within acceptable limits. So then we go on to each of the individual subsections in section 4. So if we could go to the next slide, and I put some pictures on these slides simply to give people an opportunity to rest their eyes from looking at words. They're just images to illustrate the general nature of the issues, and there's no sort of implication that they were taken in the area of the project or anything like that. But biodiversity, almost always an important issue in EESs. The draft scoping requirements include some quite long lists of species and communities. Those are the ones that the Minister for Planning may need to be able to give advice to the Commonwealth Minister in the context of the bilateral agreement, because those are things that contribute to what are called matters of national environmental significance. So they're in the scoping requirement, the draft scoping requirements, to underline the need for the proponent to make sure that those are covered, because the Minister for Planning needs to be able to cover those in the final assessment. It doesn't detract from the proponent's responsibility also to identify and address biodiversity values that may be listed or protected at state level. Offsets are part of biodiversity management in a development context these days, and those will have to be addressed in the EES. But there is an avoid, minimise, offset hierarchy, which essentially means that the process of comparing and selecting options needs to be able to show that principles of avoid and minimise have been applied as part of that overall criteria. And we do expect in EES that biodiversity values will be investigated in the field for the project, but we also expect that there will be a solid interrogation of the database and literature records that are available as well. So that can collectively provide the most comprehensive description of biodiversity values that could be affected. If we could go on to the next one, section 4.2 talks about heritage. It's bracketed for convenience in terms of the document, but there is different legislation that applies to Aboriginal cultural heritage and to historic heritage. We certainly expect that there will be thorough investigation of the databases and registers that contain information about values that have previously been identified, and they may tell much of the story, but again, there will need to be project-specific investigations, including field surveys and consultation to identify possible previously unknown values. And to the extent that there may be impacts on heritage values, those would trigger approvals requirements, which will need to be addressed in the context of the EES. If we go on to the next one, where talks about landscape and visual. High sensitivity might include, for instance, landscapes that have a significant landscape overlay under a planning scheme, or it might include sites from which there are highly valued views, such as, for instance, views towards national parks. This project is very extensive geographically. It's about 190 kilometres from one end to the other. So the expectation is that the assessment of landscape values in the EES will be based on representative viewpoints, not every possible viewpoint along the 190 odd kilometres, but there may well need to be some substantial engagement by the proponent and the proponent's consultants to ensure that the viewing locations that are identified are genuinely representative. So one of the things that submitters might put in a submission in response to the draft scoping requirements might be to identify places from which views are particularly valued. Now, the final scoping requirements won't prescribe a list of places that need to be used, but that information provided in submissions will be passed on to the proponent, and the expectation is that the proponent will give mature consideration to that amongst all the other inputs to ensure that their selection of viewpoints is fully representative. Mitigation, depending on the nature of a project, mitigation of landscape impacts can be difficult or easy, and we know that if we're looking at an overhead design with tall pylons, then mitigation options like screening may have limited effectiveness, but there are also lower level components to the project, such as terminal stations, for which that might be relevant. We go on to the next one, and the next couple, there are some quite broad brackets of issues. It doesn't mean that the issues within those brackets are of themselves less important. That's something the proponent needs to take into account, but these things all will need to be covered. Land use is perhaps one of those things that might be done iteratively as the proponent looks to narrow from an area of interest that is at least several kilometres wide, and in places tens of kilometres wide, down to a corridor. But that's something that we certainly expect to be investigated and documented. Social impact assessment is a discipline in its own right. Social impact is not the same as community opinion. So social impact can deal with things like connectivity of people to resources and facilities that they may need. So that's a specialist study area, and given the extent of this project, it's potentially a very important one. It also, this bracket of issues also picks up some things which are maybe subject to quite different impacts at the construction phase from the impacts that would be relevant to the operational phase. So again, in interpreting and applying the scoping requirements, we expect that proponents will be alert to the fact that those, in a project of this nature where those phases are quite different from each other, that they need to pick up across both phases. We go on to the next one that talks about amenity, safety and transport. Again, there is a bit of overlap with the previous bracket. These are organised for convenience, not to exclude anything. They certainly don't reflect an expectation on our part of the way that the material will ultimately be organised in the EES. Impacts on transport, again, this might pick up on impacts on infrastructure, such as deterioration of road pavements as a result of pulling heavy loads along them, but it might also relate to functionality, so interruptions to traffic. Fire risk management is intended to cover both things like ignition risks, but also impacts that may result from mitigating fire risks, such as fuel load reduction, as well as any impacts that may be identified relevant to fire management or suppression operations. But there's a number of other issues that are captured in there as well, and any comments on those will be very welcome. Then the final subsection around catchment and hydrology values. The nature of this project is that it will, from one end to the other, cross multiple waterways. It's possible perhaps that some of those waterways might be spanned rather than physically affected, but the fact that the waterways are there needs to be part of the consideration. Certainly any project involving earthworks can affect surface water movement, including under flooding or high rainfall conditions. Excavations, such as constructing foundations, can impact on groundwater. Earthworks can affect and also be affected by soil conditions, such as salinity or acid sulfate soil or contamination. And erosion in some sense, some respects can be an issue in its own right, but it can also contribute to things like sedimentation and turbidity and water quality. So those things are all, again, quite a lot of integration in the consideration of those issues is necessary. And then we have a couple of appendices on the next slide, which are essentially provided for background and for transparency. The Minister issues procedures and requirements at the time of determining a need for an EES. If the need arises, he can issue amended procedures and requirements, and that happened for a couple of EESs this year, for instance, in response to the pandemic state of emergency. But unless that happens, those procedures and requirements will effectively direct the EES process for this project as issued. And Appendix B is just the notice of the EPBC Act decision. And we're nearly through. The last slide just talks about the purpose of the scoping requirements and the sorts of things that we would be looking for in submissions. So if you identify an issue that has been omitted that should be assessed, that's a very useful input for us. If you can identify potential impact pathways that might be relevant in relation to the nature of this project and the nature of the values that it might affect. If you can identify matters that might be relevant to the choice of mitigation measures or ways in which potential impacts might be managed. It's fine for submissions to go to a depth of detail beyond what you see in the draft scoping requirements or what you see in the final scoping requirements for any other EESs. That information is still valuable because the submissions, they'll be de-identified in line with privacy requirements, but the content of the submissions will be shared with the proponent, and proponents are expected to take that information into account in the way that they apply the broad overarching principles in the scoping requirements. What we're not really looking at the moment is the merits of the project. We do sometimes at this stage receive submissions expressing views about whether the project should or shouldn't be allowed, or whether it would be a wonderful thing or a terrible thing or whatever. That's not actually going to really help us in terms of refining the scoping requirements. This process puts that onus back on the proponent once we have the scoping requirements in place to make sure that the investigations are adequate, to characterise the conditions and to characterise the impacts relative to the environment. And if it emerges at some point after the scoping requirements have been finalised that an issue emerges that's not identified in the scoping requirements, then the onus remains on the proponent to deal with it, not to say, oh, well, DELWP didn't tell us to do it, so we don't have to do it. The proponent is ultimately responsible under the Act for addressing the potentially significant effects of the project. So, and finally, we don't have, if we go to that the last slide, we don't have a prescribed format for submissions. Please just put your thoughts, your views, your suggestions into an email. The email address is there, our environment.assessment address, and the closing date for submissions also is there, which is 2 weeks from tomorrow. So we've got the submissions, we'll analyse them, we will brief the Minister, and the Minister will issue the final scoping requirements, which we will publish on the website.
Terrific, Jack. Tremendous, lots of information there, and I'm sure there's lots to muse on. So a couple of reminders, just in terms of submissions, just so it's really clear, you require submissions are closing on the 27th. They can be via email to that address, yes. And you're looking for specific recommendations or suggestions around omissions or other impacts or other mitigation ideas or suggestions for the scoping study, not the merits of the project. and not your concerns of the impacts at this stage, but really what are we studying and what are we looking at and what's important to this community. Correct, Jack?
That's wrapped it up. I took 20 minutes trying to explain that, and you've said
No.
it.
No, not at all. Lots to do. We got lots of questions. So can we get through as many? Can we get through as many as we can, Jack?
Yeah.
We've got a couple from Jane Neville. Jane's asked a couple of questions. And is that what are the rules around governing studies, and will you make these studies public to the affected communities? Yeah, that's one of her questions. Could you quickly summarise that?
Okay, so proponents generally appoint consultants to carry out the studies. So they are consultants who have specialist expertise in whatever area. The studies that they conduct are ultimately put into a report. So there will be, there might be a noise report, there might be a surface water report, there might be a flora fauna report. Those reports in their final complete form are published as part of the EES. We call them technical appendices.
Okay.
So each of those studies will be published, and this is sort of the silo side of it, if you like. Then there is a main report of the EES, and that's where the integration occurs.
Okay. They are public and they are open for peer go on to the peer review piece in a minute. But firstly, Jane's also concerned about, whilst she might feel as if the draft scoping requirements are broad and admirable, she's concerned that it's just a tick box exercise to justify plonking the project anywhere along the cheapest and easiest route. Have you got an opinion on whether it's a tick box process, not so much about the project itself, Jack?
Yeah. The scoping requirements, in one sense, can serve as a tick box. They're a way of making sure that all the necessary ground is covered. However, it's our expectation through the process that we follow through the technical reference group in particular, that work is not just done, but done well.
Yep.
And the publication of those reports as part of the EES provides a bit of transparency around the quality of that work. Ultimately, I guess, a poorly prepared EES is unlikely to serve the proponent's purposes any better than it serves anybody else's purposes.
So, Jack, just on that, Vicky Johnson writes, how and when do you decide when a peer review is required for any aspect of the EES investigation? And can you explain what the peer review process looks like?
Yeah. So there's a couple of models for peer review that have been used in the context of EESs. In some cases, proponents choose of their own initiative to commission a peer review, and that generally means identifying another specialist consultant in the same field to revisit the work that their primary consultant has done.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to understand that a peer reviewer is that. They're a peer, it's not a superior review.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Somebody else who's got comparable level of competence and expertise in the field.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's open to us is for DELWP to select and commission a peer reviewer at the proponent's cost. And in some cases, we've done that in some cases as well. Peer review might cover off on the entire topic, or it might deal with specific elements of the topic, such as the choice of a mathematical model, whether the right model was chosen, whether the right data inputs were chosen, whether the right field survey techniques were used. So it may be a focused peer review, or it may be a much broader peer review. Generally, peer review is most useful for really high priority issues that may be pivotal to the assessment of the acceptability of environmental effects.
So in this case, Jack, it might be visual impact or landscape or fire issues, because they're the sort of major topics that have been coming up because there's concerns in the community. Is that right, Jack?
So that may, that in terms of the specifics of this project, that may be right.
Might be the case, yep.
In other cases, it can be where the environmental assessment that the specialist carries out is very heavily reliant on things like mathematical modelling, and there's sort of, it may be difficult for for lay people to understand how the conclusions have been reached. So it's a way of providing a higher level of confidence to people that the conclusions that are presented in the EES have been arrived at in a technically sound and valid way.
Okay, Jack, I'm going to take you back to the alternatives. We talked a bit about the alternatives, and can you just put a bow around this one for us? A couple of questions have come through, or comments about, will the EES take into consideration undergrounding options being requested by the community, including a HVDC option? And is it true that the EES scoping will consider feasible alternatives? And how does DELWP determine what is a feasible alternative? So can you just wrap that one up a little bit again for us and describe how the proponent consideration of alternatives is different from your scoping expectation? Could you just summarise it again for us?
So in terms of the scoping requirements, and again, as I said, the scoping requirements need to be read in conjunction with the ministerial guidelines. The expectation is that the proponent will identify and investigate feasible alternatives that could deliver superior environmental outcomes.
Okay.
Clearly, there are some really qualitative terms in that sentence, and that's sort of inescapable in this territory, but the onus is on the proponent to arrive at a sound and defensible interpretation of what constitutes feasible in the context of this project, and what constitutes environmental benefits. It's common in impact assessment to find that alternatives can present quite different ranges of impacts. Can finish up with with an apples and oranges comparison, where one alternative has impacts on heritage and biodiversity, and another alternative has impacts in terms of noise and traffic and so forth. So they're both sets of impacts, they both need to be assessed, but they're not easily compared in the first instance. So that can be a challenging area for a proponent to try and come up with a sound and consistent way of presenting a comparison of those alternatives.
Yeah. I guess in summary though, Jack, you're saying that it is the proponent's responsibility through the EES process to table and do an assessment of feasible alternatives that with greater to or equal environmental benefit. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the proponent needs to think hard about what feasibility means in the context of this project, and what feasibility means for a project like this may be very different from feasibility for a quarry or a port or something like that.
Just wanted to tie that one up because there's a lot of interest in that, Jack. A couple of things. There's a couple of concerns coming through, however, about I guess the level of impact that this consultation will have on the scope. One comment is note from previous EES draft scopes that when you compare the draft and the final copy, there's not much difference, or there's never much difference between the proposed draft and the final released scope. And so the question is, does this mean that the community feedback, as in what we're doing now, has little impact or opportunity to change the scope? What would your reflections with your experience on that be, Jack?
Yeah, there's certainly some truth in that observation, and I guess we would hope that, as I mentioned, continuous improvement, that over time we get better at identifying the scope up front. But we will still give genuine consideration to every submission that comes in and every suggestion about a possibility for improving the scope. But I think the other point to bear in mind is that ultimately the EES is prepared by the proponent. We will share the substance of the submissions with the proponent, and commonly much of the substance of the submissions is in that greater depth of detail that will help the proponent to more accurately focus and point the studies that they need to carry out to fulfil the scoping requirements.
Okay. So you're clearly saying that certainly in terms of the engagement, submissions that are impactful and they're focused on things that are omissions, impact pathways and mitigation measures or issues, they'll be well regarded. If the submissions come in and they're talking about the merits of the project, they'll be less impactful in changing the scope. Is that?
They'll certainly be less helpful to us at this stage, and
good.
probably be less helpful to the proponent as well at this stage. I think it's getting into those the real substance of the environmental values that the project might affect and ways in which those values might be investigated and ways of mitigating impacts on those values. That's where the real benefit will be in this stage.
Thanks, Jack. We'll just tick on if you don't mind. You've used some language in the presentation about significant impacts, and Hugh Thompson says that's a subjective term. So the question is from Hugh, how are the impacts of the project measured, and when are the impacts deemed to be inappropriate?
Okay. It's open to proponents at any stage of preparing an EES to arrive at a conclusion that there's no way of coming up with an acceptable level of impact of the project and choosing not to take it further. Ultimately, if the project is taken all the way through the EES process, the primary focus of the minister's assessment, which is the last step in our process, is an assessment of the acceptability of the project's environmental impacts. Now, I could probably anticipate that the next question will be, well, acceptable is a qualitative term too, which it probably is. In some cases, it's not. In some cases, there are numerical limits that actually are not allowed to be exceeded. But for many values, and especially things like heritage and landscape and so forth, the reality is that we are dealing with values which are characterised in qualitative terms. It's an inescapable part of the process, and undoubtedly different people looking at the same issue will arrive at a different conclusion about where the significance threshold is or where the acceptability threshold is.
And I guess, Jack, that's what we refer to in terms of the peer review. In those areas where there's a subjective nature to the assessment, that's perhaps one of those opportunities where a second set of eyes or assessment or peer review could provide some additional confidence around the impact assessment that has occurred.
Especially where the thresholds are not easily defined. Yeah.
A couple of questions around the towers, and Carolina has asked, does the EES ensure that towers are structurally sound? And if not, who does?
So I think what the EES will need to do in the context of an issue like that is identify the construction standards that would apply under current legislation. Would expect it to identify any known emerging changes to standards or legislation and whatever approvals may be relevant to the construction process. I should stress at this point, the EES is not an approval. The EES is a process to make sure that the people who have decisions to make about approvals are able to make them in as fully informed a manner as possible, especially with respect to potential impacts on environmental values, which is and in the context of a very broad interpretation of environment. So we would expect the EES to identify construction standards that relate to elements of the project that might be constructed, and to explain how the project can be designed to comply with those standards.
Jack, we're getting lots of questions of specific nature about the project, about the specific impacts about the project, soil impact, native vegetation, cultural heritage. These are all things you've talked earlier about in terms of importance for consideration and they will be matters that the EES must address, which you have very clearly identified. So could you just confirm some of those cultural heritage related questions, and what's the process for identifying the impacts as a result of the cultural heritage matters?
So, as I said, there's sort of two brackets of heritage. There's Aboriginal cultural heritage and what we refer to as historic heritage. For Aboriginal cultural heritage, there is a process under the Aboriginal Heritage Act whereby a proponent has to prepare a thing called a cultural heritage management plan. Now that is actually under that legislation, that's a document between the proponent and the registered Aboriginal party, which is the party responsible for approving that cultural heritage management plan. But the cultural heritage management plan is prepared on the basis of investigations of cultural heritage values that will be reported in the EES to the extent that it's appropriate to do so. So if for instance, cultural heritage values of very high sensitivity occur, then it may well be culturally inappropriate for exact locations of those values to be published. But that is a process which is aligned with the EES process, and in fact, one of the triggers under the Aboriginal Heritage Act that says you must prepare a cultural heritage management plan is the requirement for an EES. For historic heritage, the Heritage Act applies, and that sets out a whole bunch of approvals requirements that may relate to impacts on or disturbance of historic heritage, depending on the classification of that heritage. And one of the realities of the EES process is that the investigations carried out for an EES often lead to the identification and registration of values that weren't previously known of, or may have been known but weren't fully understood.
Yeah, right. So Jack, that's clarified a couple of points raised. We've got lots of questions that are coming through also with regard the time this might take, and concerns that after maybe 2 years of environmental impact assessment, we still don't know what the project looks like, what route has been selected, and so could you just clarify what you expect the earliest finish time, or what are the considerations of the time it takes to do an EES? Because people have to make financial decisions based on their properties, and they don't know what to do, whether to stay, whether to go. Because I mean, I think that timing is one thing. Jack, could you just talk us through what the seasonal aspects of the EES process and all that sort of thing?
There are certainly elements of EES investigations that inevitably take time. You mentioned seasonal aspects. So if you've got spring flowering orchids that may an environmental value and you need to go and look for them in the spring, well, we're nearly at the end of the spring now. If you haven't looked for them this year, you can't look for them until next year.
Yes.
Proponents are expected to produce at an early stage of the EES process, are expected to produce an indicative timetable for the work that they to carry out to get the EES to the point of exhibition. That's been done in this case, and our expectation from that is that the EES will be ready for exhibition somewhere towards the middle of 2022. We don't have a mechanism for enforcing that. It's a matter for the proponent. The only thing that the proponent needs to understand, and that everybody needs to understand, is that decisions about approvals for the project may not happen until the Minister's assessment has been considered, and the Minister's assessment is the final step in the process. So to the extent that the proponent has time imperatives that it wishes to be able to meet or respond to, there's an incentive there, if you like, for the proponent to work expeditiously to pull it together. But there's nothing in the legislation or the environmental effects statement process that is able to apply obligations on a proponent to do things in a particular time.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily good comfort for many of the communities who are being affected right now, Jack, but we accept your note there. Jane Neville was written by email. She said there's an example of a project, one called the Kent Bruck Green Power Hub, and they're establishing a community advisory committee as part of their EES process. Could you share some, some insights as to whether you believe AusNet or whether DELWP will be inviting that type of process to occur, and whether there'll be an independent chair, and what type of role that might play in providing a really robust EES process, Jack?
So that's something that I believe has been done in that case as an element of the EES consultation plan.
Okay.
Something that the proponent has chosen to do. We don't have a sort of standard set of rules for consultation plans because of the fact that the nature of the community that might be affected by a project can be so different from one project to another, and it does need to be tailored. That project is in an area where there is quite a small and sort of fairly readily defined population. So it is different in a number of respects from the community, the broad community that might be affected by this project. That's not to say that something like that might not be a good idea, but that would be something that the proponent would need to make a judgment about as to whether it's a good way of adding value to the community engagement.
Right. In the time we have, Jack, just a couple more. In terms of, Richard has posted a question about size of the towers and the size of the type of towers, single versus double towers, and those which have less visual impact, and they could easily follow roads. Is that something you'd be looking at perhaps as a construction alternative, as the proponent could put forward as an alternative to minimising visual impact? Is that what you're
It absolutely could be. If that's something that where you've got potentially different ways of designing the project. I presume that with those towers, there are probably different trade-offs involved in those considerations. Again, that's something that the EES would just have to describe. But yes, absolutely.
That's what you'd expect.
It's just the sort of thing that might.
Yeah. Okay. Just in terms of a couple more. Once this is an anonymous post of tonight. Once the EES scoping is finalised, we understand that DELWP has to agree with the proponent a list of reports to be prepared for the EES. Is that correct, firstly? And then secondly, does DELWP in this process clarify the scope of each report with the proponent, so it isn't just up to AusNet to decide? So I think this person's looking for that confidence that the work itself is to meeting your expectations.
Yeah.
Could you describe what the process is, Jack?
So one of the inputs to the draft scoping requirements is what's called a study program that the proponent prepares. So that essentially is the proponent's first take on what they think might need to be investigated. Ultimately, proponents commonly sort of revisit that study program in the context of what the scoping requirements say. So it's sort of an iterative process. The technical reference group is an important part of this exercise as well.
Could you talk that through a little bit more? Who is on the technical reference group? How do you get on it? Who selects it? Who pays for them?
So DELWP establishes and convenes the technical reference group. It comprises representatives of public authorities and government agencies that either may have a statutory decision-making role, or that may have technical expertise that will help in ensuring that the EES is prepared to an adequate standard. It's not a decision-making body. And it doesn't have community representation. The engagement with the community is the responsibility of the proponent under its consultation plan. But the sorts of organisations that are represented on the TRG, the local government authorities are represented, catchment management authorities, Energy Safe Victoria, EPA, the registered Aboriginal parties who have a statutory decision-making role are on the TRG as well. But we have responsibility for convening that TRG and for ensuring that the proponent is in a position to respond to the technical advice that comes back. A big part of the TRG's work is reviewing drafts of the technical reports that the specialists produce and providing expert feedback on those, so that the final versions of those reports, which are building blocks of the EES and which will be published when the EES is exhibited, they're able to be the best reports that they can be.
Can you just, we have reached the end of our allotted 8 o'clock, but there's so many questions. If you could just bear with us for another 5 or so minutes, is that possible?
That's fine. Yep.
Yeah, great. I just don't want to shortcut some of these very important questions. Let's go for another 5 minutes if we can, everyone. Anonymous submission, but I think it's one that's captured quite a lot of the tone on the questions tonight, is that if in the view of the community and their specialists, the community specialists, if the proponent provides a canned response or a misleading or what they think is an incorrect analysis of their responses, but they seem plausible or tangible on face value, is there an opportunity for the community to review the material and provide feedback to DELWP during the EES process in order to provide the DELWP with a balanced view of the accuracy and justifiability of the proponent's responses? There's a fair bit in there, Jack, but I think is there a chance during either the draft EES phase or the final EES phase for you to receive feedback on the EES findings and present at public hearing, for instance, specialist views brought to the table by others?
So, in terms of exhibition of the EES, absolutely. It is open to any submitter in response to the exhibited EES to call their own experts and have them present at the public inquiry, which will happen post-exhibition. During the preparation of the EES, we expect that the proponent's consultation plan will include opportunities for the proponent to share the emerging findings of their EES investigations with the community. Listen to feedback from the community. If that feedback is, we think you've missed something, we think you've got this wrong, we think you need to revisit that, then we expect the proponent to take a considered approach to that feedback. Whether the feedback is right, I don't know at this point, obviously, but we do expect that proponents will take that on board, and it's in the proponent's interest to do so, because if it's a valid issue, it is certainly going to come up again at the formal submission stage.
Yeah, look, thank you, Jack. So you've really described a fair bit of the process tonight. Where would people go to find out more about the steps? I think that we've in the chat box there's a couple of links to EES homepage, DELWP. That's a good place to go for information. I think we've also shared with you the draft scoping requirements that's been shared with everyone tonight. Just a reminder of what your calls for submissions by closing by 27th. Could you just summarise again what you're looking for in submissions to you via email?
Yes, so just there's no standard format, no template for submissions. All we need is an email to that environment.assessment address saying these are the things that I would like to raise in terms of the draft scoping requirements, issues that I think have been overlooked or poorly described or whatever, possible impact pathways that may not be adequately represented or acknowledged, and possible matters for options for management or mitigation of impacts that may have been overlooked. But the way those are structured, it can be a dot point email. It doesn't need to be sort of deathless prose. It just needs to get the message across. And as I say, think in terms of the fact that we will also share these with the proponent, and they will add, especially the submissions which go into that higher level of detail, will add some light and shade to the scoping requirements themselves, and we do expect that proponents will take that information on board and make sensible judgments about how they take it forward. So we may, for instance, get a number of submissions that say, I think when you're doing your landscape impact assessment, that this is a really important point to use for your consideration of landscape. Now, it may be that a dozen people all identify points very close to each other that relate to the same basic view of the landscape. It doesn't necessarily mean that the proponent has to go out and use all of those, but we do expect that they will make a sensible judgment about how to identify a set of representative points, and that may well include some of those points. But if
Jack, yeah,
mentioned, then they may not be aware that they're important.
Before we let everyone go, turnaround time. So submission close on the 27th. When will DELWP have finalised the scoping requirements in the final form, and when will that be made public, Jack?
Yeah. So the process that we have to go through is to analyse the submissions that come in, and I guess there's a bit of a piece of string aspect to that, because we don't know how many we will receive, and we don't know how big a task that will be in this particular case. But we analyse them, we brief the Minister, and it is the Minister for Planning who will issue the final scoping requirements. Clearly, our closing date is only about 4 weeks short of Christmas. If we can get all that work done so that the Minister is in a position to issue the final scoping requirements before Christmas, we would love to be able to do that. Whether that's going to be practically achievable, I can't say, but that's the sort of target that we would be trying to work towards.
Great. Thank you, Jack, for sharing your time and insights to the process tonight. I hope everyone who's been with us learned something from that. I'm so sorry we didn't get through all your questions, but just a reminder on the questions. They've all been recorded. They'll be split between project-related specific questions, and the team behind the scenes will make sure that the AusNet team will have those, and they'll be replying to you in a way that they have been doing so normally. Those that relate to the process, Jack's team will have those. But more specifically, I think the call to action tonight is look at the scoping requirements, reflect on what you've heard tonight, reflect on Jack's answers to some of the questions. And if you can, simplest thing is a dot point email to the team using the email address that's on screen. And that'll be greatly received, I'm sure, by the team. Just a final also, that tonight has been video, so for those who haven't been able to watch it, you're welcome to, well, in fact, if you're not watching it now, you won't know that you're not watching it later. It'll be video, it'll be on the website. Also, Jack's slides tonight will also be on the project team website, so just for the public record, they'll be all there. Unless there's any other business. Jack, have you got any closing remarks or observations before we let you go?
Only that we look forward to the submissions that come in and trying to make the scoping requirements the best that we can. And we also really encourage the community to take advantage of all the opportunities after the scoping requirements have been finalised to take part in the engagement processes under the proponent's engagement consultation plan, and ultimately the opportunity to make submissions when the EES is exhibited. And if there are questions about process at any time, that same environment.assessment email address is the one to use, and we will respond to those as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Jack, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We wish you a very safe and happy week, and we look forward to receiving your submissions to DELWP on your behalf, Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone. Good night, then.
Good night.